Welcome to the SEI podcast series, a production of Carnegie Mellon University's Software Engineering Institute. The SEI is a federally funded research and development center operated at Carnegie Mellon University and funded through the United States Department of Defense. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Dr. Carol Woody and Chris Alberts, who have done some recent work on a software assurance framework. And there's some blog posts and a technical note out there for you all to reference, but we're here to talk about that work. Before we get into that discussion, could I ask you each to introduce yourselves and talk about a little bit of your history? Carol, if you would start.
Glad to. I'm the technical manager for cybersecurity engineering, and my work is focused on trying to draw from operational security and bring it into the development lifecycle. We're especially interested in strengthening the capabilities of addressing cybersecurity early in the life cycle when it can be done at lower cost and certainly without all the pain and angst that we're dealing with in terms of operational response to attacks. So we're aiming at how do we minimize the attack surface and a lot of the security challenges in the operational side through effectively addressing engineering and development, applying good cybersecurity practices.
Great, thanks. Chris, if you go ahead.
I'm a principal engineer here at the Software Engineering Institute in the CERT division, and I've been at the SEI since 1995. I started in the software risk management area, moved over to CERT a few years later, and started in the operational security part of research, and where I led the development of the Octave risk analysis for operational systems. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, joined Carol and started looking earlier in the life cycle and really taking that risk management perspective and starting to look at how do you engineer practice controls into software-reliant systems, starting really early in the requirements through the architecture and design and through the code. And the current work is really looking at how do we integrate good cybersecurity practices in with good software and systems engineering practices.
Okay, so you've had some good experience with customers. One of the great things we do at the SEI, I think, is engage people who have real needs, and we learn from the work that they're doing using the material we publish. And I think the blog post does a very nice job of illustrating pilots you've had. Could I ask you to kind of take turns and talk through the pilots a little bit, and maybe start with Dr. Woody?
Well, one of the first areas we were looking at was supporting the DoD in their efforts to initiate work in software assurance. And so we were asked to identify what practices they were doing that effectively addressed the cyber issues and where there were possible gaps. So in order for us to address the gaps, we had to basically structure a baseline to compare them against. And we assembled that through a lot of the experiences that we had had in the operational side, tied it back to expertise that we have here in acquisition and engineering, to essentially identify what are critical practices that really belong to engineering and development and throughout the rest of the life cycle, and link that up to DoD's acquisitions to give a strong relationship there for a baseline, and then we could identify the engineering practices that were supporting that baseline and potential gaps for them to address.
So it's not just identifying practices, but making sure that the timing for the best execution of those practices and the people responsible for them, that you're identifying those linkages, that makes the practices more effective?
Yes, it puts them where they need to be in terms of who can be the most effective in addressing them.
Great. And if I could turn to Chris, you applied goal question metric in one of the pilots that I read about in your blog post. And I think that would be particularly interesting to our audience. If you would elaborate that a little bit.
Yeah, that's the most recent pilot that we've been working on, where we started with, we have the practices in the framework and focusing on the engineering practices. Kind of digressing a second, we have the practices now arranged in process management, project management, engineering, and support.
So that's familiar categories.
Yes, that's kind of the basic structure that we followed. And so we focused on the engineering practices for this particular pilot activity. And what we did is we used the practices in each of those areas as kind of the overarching goals, and then constructed a set of detailed questions to elicit a range of metrics. And so we came up with a large candidate list. And then we worked with the organization to kind of pare down that list to a starter set of metrics that they're now starting to implement.
And that starter set's available in the context of the blog post, and you can see the linkage from goals to questions to sample metrics.
Right.
I think that's a particularly powerful way of communicating experience that people have had. It goes beyond just the concept, and it talks about instances of it. Could you talk about your other pilots a little bit, and maybe pass it back to Dr. Woody?
The key areas relative to addressing cybersecurity have not been well recognized by high maturity organizations. And so one of the areas that we have been looking at is how do we articulate what needs to be added to all of these excellent engineering practices to bring them up to the level we need for cybersecurity. One of these high maturity organizations came to us to help them identify what practices are missing. And so we were assembling for them not only what practices they needed to do, but where did these need to be integrated into their current policies and procedures so that they could make sure that they were not losing the quality efforts that they already have in place. And I think one of the real telling points that came out of our review of that is that there really needs to be someone who owns the responsibility for software assurance and cybersecurity across the life cycle. Right now, we have people that own process improvement. We have people that own configuration management and certain responsibility areas that are cross-cutting. And we really need someone that owns the cybersecurity responsibility. Traditionally, it's been left to the security operational side.
After the product's out.
And that's way too late. And so actually building it in and integrating it requires transferring some of that responsibility earlier.
So you have a focal point. And I think there was an observation in your blog post about requirements and how we might think about requirements development and requirements management in light of these needs. Could you elaborate that?
Yeah, I think before I get to that, the broader point of view is we don't think of security as an add-on, so we want to integrate it into the process. And requirements is a very good example of how we did that. When we looked at the requirements development process, we noticed that some of the good practices that we recommend for generating security requirements were not covered in their current processes. So we recommended that they create an add-on process or integrate that perspective into their current processes or create a separate one. It didn't matter how they did it, but they needed to address that. So from the development point of view, then they could develop a good set of security requirements. But from the management point of view, we felt that the current processes they had in place, they could handle the security requirements and manage them just like they manage every other type of requirement. So we identified areas where we needed to integrate security in and areas where what they had was sufficient. But the one thing that our philosophically we didn't want to do is to say that here's your cybersecurity process and it's standalone from everything else. It's integrated in with all the things that they need to do.
So along with the responsibilities being focused on a person who is charged with these things, the fact that processes are able to accommodate requirements relating to security in a high maturity organization was particularly encouraging. The different perspective that people bring when they document requirements or elicit requirements relating to security. Could you contrast that with the way people think about requirements for a product's functionality and how different is that perspective of the person who, Carol, you talked about being the focal point versus someone who's a product manager, perhaps?
Some of it relates to how we do good engineering nowadays. And traditionally, engineers have been trained at both the systems and the software level to decompose pieces down to components and build the components effectively to meet the requirements. What we're seeing with cybersecurity, though, is that it's really how the components are integrated and how they work together with the infrastructure as well as the user operational interactions that either protect the structure and environment from an attack or provide holes and conduits for attackers to get to data that we and functionality that we don't want them to get to. So we have a mindset that's built into the existing practices that they are very componentized and subdivided, and it's this cross-cutting look that is missing relative to security.
So it's not the unforeseen behavior of an individual component, it's the combination of them and the unforeseen things that can happen there. This is very much in keeping, Chris, with the work you've done of taking risk and going earlier in the life cycle with risk and going to places where decisions are made or failed to be made early on. So this really is a continuation of the focus you've had. Could you elaborate a bit about risk here?
Yeah, sure. The focal point of most of the techniques that we're doing right now are risk-based. And so what we are doing is essentially looking at how the system likely will be used. Let's say we're building a system or acquiring a system that's software-based. We want to know how that might be used in operations, what mission threads it might support, and how it would support them, and how the data flows through the various systems, because we're really talking about a system of systems environment. And so once we understand how data is supporting the mission thread, now that we try to do is we figure out how can we break it. And so it's that kind of that attacker perspective that we try to bring into the engineering process and look at what if we affect the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of various data flows, what would that do ultimately to the mission thread and to the stakeholders who have an interest in that mission thread. And that's kind of how we look at risk. And then once we do that, we identify what are the design implications, what can we incorporate into the design that might be able to counteract that, and that can influence the requirements, the architecture, the detailed design, and so forth. And that's what we're focusing on. That's how we're bringing the risk perspective earlier in the life cycle.
Great, great. And Carol, I know your contributions to helping people think clearly on these topics and education in general, I think, has been something your work has focused a lot in terms of curricula. Now this new framework is another collection of some pretty powerful stuff. Could you talk a little bit about the audience for the tech note that you've published?
We really see the audience as being a combination of the organizational level as well as individual projects or acquisitions, because the practices really require a integration across what a specific system development activity would have, as well as the ways in which the policies and practices of an organization influence that, linked to the way the infrastructure is built and supported, because the attacker is not exclusively just focusing on the content of one subset of this process. They're looking at how all these pieces are glued together, which is ultimately what is fielded in the operational environment. So we're trying to take the thinking of this is how it's going to actually run and the kinds of exposures it's going to have to deal with, and driving that back into you have to build it to accommodate those challenges.
So there's really quite a variety of people who you are trying to reach with the work you're doing.
I refer to it as a team sport.
Okay.
Because you are looking at decisions that engineers are making. You're looking at decisions that organizations are making based on trading off cost and schedule. You're looking at the competencies that they provide within a development activity. And you're also looking at the tools and techniques that they provide and give people time to use, and make sure that they know how to apply them effectively. So there's a wide range of these practices that really have to all integrate across the life cycle for effective results.
And the work you've done with the pilots that we've spoken only briefly of so far, really, you can see the three instances being described being a fairly diverse group. Now, I saw in the blog post you went from version 0.1 to 0.2. Where are you with the versioning of this product now?
Well, we're still with version 0.2. That's the current prototype, and I consider it still to be a working prototype. The idea is that we've done some pilots. We've gotten internal people assisting us in building the framework. What we'd like to do over time is to get more community involvement, grow the product, make it into a real product type, ready for prime time kind of a product,
okay.
and then transition it. And that's kind of our long-term focus. And we're just starting on the path towards that.
So the tech note you've published will give people an early look at work,
Exactly.
and it may form a basis for them pursuing future communications with you all, maybe offering input to you, maybe engaging your services to look at how this plays out in their team.
Right.
And I think near term we'll be publishing more information about the metrics we've identified and the potential output documents that those could be reflected in, specifically in the acquisition process, to give people an opportunity to try and see how they can manage acquisitions better using some of this information.
Great. So we've covered a variety of good topics here. What have I left out? What more do you want to get to the audience?
I think one of the key points that I keep running into is that people say they can't do anything because they're later in the life cycle. And my response is start where you are. We have basically assembled practices that run the gamut of the life cycle, and there's no reason to not at least do the ones that you still have time to before you're fielding a system. That may mean that you carry over risks from earlier things you didn't do, but certainly with approaches like Agile and DevOps that are coming into play, you've got these opportunities then to address those gaps in the next cycle. So there's no reason to not get started.
Good advice, I think. Very good advice. Last words from you.
I guess what I'd like to emphasize again is that the nature of engineering cybersecurity, and as Carol said, it is a team sport, and it requires people with security expertise, people with software and systems engineering expertise working together, and doing it in a way that fits in with the way they're already doing business. If what we've seen time and again, if people try to make security a separate activity, it just won't get done.
Good advice. Good advice. Carol and Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks.
Glad to be here.
As always, this podcast will be available on the SEI's website, as well as Carnegie Mellon University's iTunes U site. If you'd like to read more about the Software Assurance Framework, you could go to the SEI's homepage at www.sei.cmu.edu and type in the acronym SAF in the search box, and it will take you directly to the technical note. Thank you very much for joining us today.